The art we recognize as Greek was produced in the millennium between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. The temple at Sunion was built in the great classical period of Athenian triumph, but centuries before, Greek society was already recognizably different from the other cultures of the ancient Near East. Persia and Egypt were mighty empires ruled by dynasties that gave themselves the status of gods. The Greeks lived in small city-states under the rule of petty kings. The scale of these small Greek communities, clinging to a rocky landscape, never far from the sea, made them vulnerable to attack from larger forces, but also threw them back on their resources of fitness, strength, intelligence, calculation, and above all, individual heroism. The idea of the individual, standing proudly independent, is one of the most powerful and resilient ideas in human history. The figure of the Kouros shows this idea taking the center of the stage. Andrew Stewart teaches at the University of California at Berkeley.
It's often said that statues like this are emblematic of early Greek culture. I think they are, and I think they are for 4 reasons. The sculptor has taken the statue's clothes off. Convinced that man is the measure of all things, he allows him to stand free and proud, allows your eyes to roam unobstructed across his body. He's autonomous. The sculptor has stripped away the back pillar and the screen between the legs of the Egyptian statues that were his predecessors, and has allowed him to walk forward in 3-dimensional space. He's beautiful. He's also youthful. The sculptor has chosen that period between 18 and 21 that the Greeks believed was the prime of one's life, the acme of one's existence on this earth. As a result, the statue could serve one of 2 main functions. It could be offered to the gods, particularly to Apollo, the epitome of this youthful ideal projected upon the heavens, or it could stand above the grave of a man of any age, reminding his descendants of that time when he was in the prime of his life, standing youthful, proud, autonomous, beholden to no one, the measure of all things.
The male figure, naked, proud, idealized, did have a female equivalent in the Kore. She too is beautiful, but she is serene rather than heroic. She's clothed and static, not boldly striding forward like the male. The turn of the 6th century to the 5th century BC saw one of the most dramatic transitions in history, political and social. It coincided with an equally dramatic transition in art. The Critian boy of the early 5th century BC is the Kouros come to life. He has relaxed his body and come closer to the appearance of nature. We can only speculate about and imagine the relationship between the development of democracy in the Greek city-states and the development of an unprecedented realism in art. But both, in their quite separate ways, reveal a new excitement in the idea that individual human beings can take charge of their own destiny, even though they do so under the capricious gaze of man-like gods. The Zeus, recovered from the wreck of Artemisium, shows the new freedom and confidence of sculptors modeling clay rather than carving stone, and translating the clay model by casting it in bronze.
The Zeus describes his power by reaching his hand far out over his realm, brandishing his thunderbolt, gazing unwaveringly towards the horizon. He stands like an icon of divine power. It tells us that Zeus is king of the universe, that his power is infinite, that he is a supremely poised being by comparison with the hubbub and turmoil of man's life on Earth. The fact that his physique is no different from that of an athlete or a hero of the same time is simply a continuation of the standard Greek notion that the gods are made in human form, that you project your own notions of male beauty onto the heavens.
The triumph of democracy, a more restricted matter than the mass democracies of today, but nevertheless a dramatic change from tyranny, coincided with the triumph of the Athens of Pericles. Pericles was not a tyrant, but a leader chosen by the Athenian citizens as their representative. He led Athens through a period of reconstruction after the wars with the Persians, wars which had left Athens in ruins, but finally rid of its great enemy, and at the head of a league of Greek city-states. The mid-5th century BC was the period of Athens' greatest influence, not only on the Greek world at that time, but on subsequent history. The most impressive and evocative monument to that influence is the Acropolis, the citadel which still dominates Athens. Pericles used the resources, or some contemporaries argued, abused them, to rebuild the Acropolis and crown it with the Parthenon.
The bold simplicity of the building, with its strictly harmonized repetition of the most basic geometric shapes, has had an unparalleled influence on the architecture of the world. The creators of the Parthenon, including the sculptor Phidias and the architect Iktinos, adapted the traditional temple form, but refined it. They created an impression of subtlety and lightness, despite the scale of the building and the massiveness of its marble surface. The sculptural decorations employed the skills of hundreds of craftsmen and set a new standard in art. It took less than a decade to erect this monument to Athenian pride. It was built on the ruins of a temple destroyed by the Persians and in part glorified the victory of the Greeks over their greatest enemy. But to their subsequent cost, the Athenians took more than their share of the benefits of Persian defeat. At home they may have been democratic, but to their fellow Greeks, such as the Corinthians and Spartans, they appeared arrogant and domineering. They felt that the protection of their founding goddess, Athena, had given them a special status. This special relationship was celebrated in a procession to honor the goddess.
Today, the Parthenon is most admired for the exquisite harmony of its architecture and for the refinement of its friezes. But to the ancient Athenians, it was admired for something rather different, what lay inside the temple. And that was a statue of Athena nearly 40 feet high. That's only 5 feet below the ceiling as we look at it today. A statue armed, covered with gold, in all its dress from head to foot, the skin ivory, with monsters on its helmet and a great serpent by its side. To us, that would seem garish, grandiose, and unrestrained. But that was the core of the building. And if you put yourself in the position of an ancient Athenian, perhaps coming from the Panathenaic procession, in the broad daylight, the blue skies, and dazzling light of an Attic August, and then going inside that building, we can imagine what it felt like to see that statue as the eyes became accustomed to the gloom and saw the glitter of the gold, the jeweled eyes reflected in the pool below the statue. The effect must have been overwhelming.
We can only imagine the impact created by the goddess and her surroundings. Our attempts to reconstruct the statue's appearance, like this one from the 19th century, can merely hint at the experience of seeing it in its dramatic context. But it does remind us how vivid, how colorful Greek art must have been in classical times. Bleached by the centuries and sterilized by the surroundings of the museum, the reliefs of the Parthenon frieze appear cool and restrained. But originally they would have been brightly colored and even more lifelike than they are now. Their depiction of the Panathenaic procession would have been still more convincing, art and nature coming closer together than ever before.
The frieze is generally regarded as representing the high point in the classical style. Composition is still rather formal, almost mechanical, but it's enlivened by a great many realistic details of gesture and posture. Figures are, that's rather unemotional, but highly idealized. The whole thing seems to represent a balance between that Greek preoccupation with composition, proportion, and a growing sense of realism.
The illusion of reality is created even more impressively in the massive sculptures of the pediments, the gables at each end of the building.
What seems to happen is that they were creating, so far as they could, more successful images of man by varying the representation of details. There was, as it were, a sort of natural selection of forms, and the forms that were eventually adopted naturally tended to be the more realistic ones. Add to it, remember, the colouring of the hair and the eyes, which would add to this realistic effect. And as soon as they succeeded in understanding how the human figure worked, that it was not simply an assemblage of patterns and volumes, they moved very rapidly to the point at which they could create a human figure in 2 dimensions or in 3 dimensions, which realistically portrayed quite subtle poses, postures, and actions. This was the major breakthrough. This is the thing which marked out Greek art from that of all contemporary cultures. This, at least in sculpture, was the point at which Greek art took off in a totally new direction and informed the whole Western tradition.
The Athenian ascendancy did not survive the 5th century BC. Athenian democracy itself was always vulnerable. But Athenian culture, its philosophy, literature, and drama, as much as its architecture, sculpture, and painting, maintained a hold over the Greek and the Western imagination. 5th century Athens created a classical ideal against which all subsequent art could be measured.
Here the sculptor has refocused the youthful ideal of the Kouros and the Parthenon Frieze and the Getty bronze behind me onto the person of one man, Alexander the Great. What he's doing here is to appropriate the ideals of Periclean Athens and to show Alexander as the logical successor of those young men who fought in the Peloponnesian War for Athens' greater glory, and who tried to establish her empire ever further and wider. No individual had ever achieved so much in the history of mankind, at least as far as the Greeks remembered it. No individual had incorporated within himself qualities which were so conspicuously heroic. So we have here an image that derives its authority from the past, the human, the heroic, the divine, but at the same time looks very definitely towards the future.
The future that Alexander promised was an empire that would spread across 2 million square miles. Greek towns and Greek language and culture were established deep into Asia, some as far from their source as India. Alexander died when he was only 33, and his monumental project could not sustain itself. But the model of the Greek state he exported, of a civilized city in a barbarian landscape, became the model for the Greek city-states for the next 300 years. One such city was Pergamon, built in what is now Turkey in the 2nd century BC. The Pergamene rulers were neither democratic nor especially heroic, but they borrowed the heroic forms of Alexander's time and of classical Athens to express their ideals and values. But in their art, like the carvings on the great altar of Zeus, the Pergamenes depicted the struggle between the gods, heroes, and giants, between the rational and the irrational, with a violence and passion that the classical Athenians never permitted themselves.
You can feel the drill ripping into that stone to create that writhing hair of the giants. You can feel the chisel cutting away to create feathers or skin or scales, or muscles or drapery or whatever. You can feel the rasp making those immense range of surface textures together with the polish. So here the sculptor is foregrounding his own technique. There's a notion of creativity going on here, which is quite different from anything that we've seen in the past. The technique of the Parthenon Frieze is self-effacement. Here, the emphasis is on artistic creation.
The creative force of Greek art after Alexander has been reproduced ever since, in the direct copies of the Roman period, in the rediscoveries and recreations of the Renaissance, and in heroic art up to today.
The great altar of Pergamon is one of the most impressive and characteristic monuments from ancient Greek culture. And yet, At the time it was finished, about 170 BC, the age of these independent Greek city-states and kingdoms like Pergamon was nearing its end, as a new power pushed its order across the Mediterranean: Rome. The Romans conquered Greece in the middle of the 2nd century BC. They would surpass the Greeks in political power, in military might, in technological innovation. But the Romans would be forever in Greece's debt in the fields of philosophy, science, literature, and the arts. As the Roman poet said, "Captive Greece made Rome captive." The visual language devised by the Greeks would be adopted by the Romans and subsequently by the entire Western tradition. Indeed, it would become the preeminent means of portraying order, rationality, harmony, and power, whether in dictatorships, despotisms, or democracies. Ironically, though, the lesson which the Greeks understood and which their artists expressed in great works like this and in the Parthenon sculptures, namely that the disruptive and frightening forces of the irrational will always threaten to burst out in human history, that lesson would have to be learned again and again.